The wind moved first. It rolled across the high grass of southern Britain like a warning breath, bending reeds and rattling loose leather straps against shields. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky was already bruised, dark blue bleeding slowly into gray. Somewhere beyond the low hills, the Saxon camps burned through the night, their fires flickering like angry eyes in the distance. Steel whispered as swords were drawn and checked, then returned to their scabbards. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, breath visible in the cold air. Most were farmers once. Some were boys. All of them were afraid. A horn sounded, low, distant, answered by another farther east. From the center of the camp, a figure stepped forward. Arthur did not wear a crown. His cloak was plain wool, damp with dew. His armor bore scratches from earlier battles, dents hammered out but never erased. He looked less like a king and more like what he truly was, a war leader holding together a fractured land with force of will alone. Behind him, banners stirred. The red dragon of the Britons lifted against the wind. "Listen," Arthur said quietly. The men leaned in. Leather creaked. A horse snorted. "They will come with numbers. They always do." He paused, eyes scanning the line. "They believe this land is weak, divided, that we are relics of a dying world." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Arthur's voice hardened. "Today we remind them that Britain still bleeds. And when it bleeds, it bites back." A sword was raised behind him, not in threat, but in resolve. The blade caught what little light there was. Excalibur. The name itself carried weight, though few dared speak it aloud. Some said it was forged by Roman hands. Others whispered of older things. Iron blessed by druids, cooled in sacred waters. To the soldiers, none of that mattered. What mattered was that wherever that blade rose, men followed. A rider approached at speed, hooves tearing at the wet ground. "My king!" The scout gasped, sliding from the saddle. "Saxon longships. More than 30. They've landed along the river mouth." Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment. "So it begins." The river ran dark and swollen from spring rain. Mist clung to its surface, masking movement, muffling sound. Along its banks, Britain skirmishers crouched low, round shields pressed into mud, spears angled toward the water. The first Saxon boats appeared like ghosts. Oars dipped in perfect rhythm. Shields lined the sides, painted with crude symbols, wolves, ravens, broken crosses. Their warriors stood packed together, helmets glinting faintly, axes resting on shoulders as if this were merely another raid. They were wrong. A sharp whistle cut the air. Arrows fell from the fog. Wood cracked. Men screamed. One longship veered sharply as its helmsman collapsed, an arrow buried in his throat. Another smashed into the riverbank. Warriors spilling into the shallows, shouting in fury. "Now!" came the cry. Britons surged from cover. Spears struck first, short, brutal thrusts aimed low. Shields slammed into chests. The fighting collapsed into chaos almost instantly, the air thick with breath, blood, and shouted curses in two languages that hated each other. Steel rang. A Saxon axe tore through a shield rim, lodging deep. The Briton holding it screamed as another blade opened his thigh. He fell, dragged back by a comrade before boots crushed his skull. From the rear, a new sound rose. Hooves. Arthur and his mounted guard thundered down from higher ground, cloaks snapping behind them. The impact was devastating. Horses plowing into the sordid Saxon ranks, riders hacking downward with practiced precision. Arthur struck without hesitation. Excalibur flashed, one clean cut, then another. No wasted motion. No roar of triumph. Just grim efficiency. A Saxon warrior lunged at him, eyes wild. Arthur turned the blow aside and drove his blade forward. The man dropped, choking, blood darkening the river water. For a moment, it seemed the landing might be broken. Then the horn sounded again, louder, closer, from the river mouth. More ships emerged, filling the fog with dark shapes. Too many. Arthur felt it then, the shift, the subtle, terrible change when a battle turns from opportunity to endurance. "Pull back!" a captain shouted. Too late. The Saxons surged ashore in waves, howling now, emboldened by numbers. Shields locked, Axes rose and fell. The Briton line bent, then began to buckle. Arthur raised his sword high. "Hold!" he shouted. "Hold the line." Men rallied to his voice, planting their feet in the mud, shields overlapping. For every step they lost, they paid in blood. Somewhere to the left, a banner fell. Arthur saw it and felt the weight of every death pressing it on him. Camelot was not a fortress of stone yet, only an idea, fragile and unfinished. If they broke here, the heart of the kingdom would lie open, and far from the river, beyond the clash of iron and the screams of the wounded, another figure watched the smoke rise. Lancelot. He sat astride a dark horse on a wooded ridge, helmet under his arm, jaw tight. His detachment had been ordered to wait, for the signal, for the moment that would decide everything. He could hear the battle now. The clash carried on the wind. He whispered to himself, "Be in time." The signal fire had not yet burned. Down by the river, Arthur fought on, unaware of how close the line was to breaking, or how much this day would cost him, in blood, in loyalty, and in the fragile bonds that held his realm together. The fog thickened. The river ran red, and Britain held its breath. The line did not break all at once. It bent, creaked, and groaned like old timber under a rising tide. Arthur felt it through his arm each time his shield absorbed a blow. The Saxons were pressing harder now, bodies packed tight, their war cries raw and animal. Mud sucked at boots. Blood made the riverbank slick, men slipping, falling, vanishing beneath boots and blades before anyone could pull them free. "Steady!" Arthur shouted, though his voice was already hoarse. Shield to shield. A young soldier to his right, barely more than a boy, nodded with wide eyes, knuckles white around his spear. An axe smashed into the lad's shield, splitting the wood. Arthur stepped in without thinking, parrying the follow-up strike and driving Excalibur up beneath the Saxon's ribs. The body sagged heavy, and Arthur shoved it away. There was no time to mourn. From behind the Saxon ranks came the pounding of more boots, more shouting. Reinforcements. Always reinforcements. A horn sounded from the Briton rear. Short, urgent. Arthur knew the signal. They were running out of space. Out of time. "Fall back to the stones," he commanded. The stones were the remains of an old Roman causeway, half buried but still firm. If they could anchor the line there, the Saxons would lose their footing advantage. The retreat was brutal. Order dissolved into instinct. Men dragged the wounded. Others turned again and again to strike, buying second with their lives. One captain went down under 3 Saxons, screaming for his men to keep moving even as axes rose and fell on him. The Britons reached the stones just as the Saxons surged forward again. Shields slammed together. The sound echoed like thunder trapped in fog. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to noise and breath. Iron on iron, the wet slap of boots, the choking smell of blood and river water. Arthur's arm burned. His shoulders ached. Each swing of his sword felt heavier than the last. A Saxon war leader pushed forward, taller than the rest, his helmet crowned with a blackened crest. He laughed as he fought, a harsh, barking sound. "You're dying on borrowed land, King," the man spat in broken Brittonic. Arthur answered with steel. Their blades met again and again, sparks flashing even in the gray light. The Saxon was strong, terribly strong, but he fought with fury, not discipline. Arthur waited, absorbing, reading the rhythm. The opening came in a blink. Excalibur cut through mail and flesh in a single decisive stroke. The Saxon leader collapsed without another sound. For a moment, the Saxons hesitated. Arthur seized it. He raised a sword, its blade streaked dark. "Britain stands," he roared. The shout carried down the line. Men repeated it, ragged, desperate, but alive. Then came a new sound. A horn, long and clear, from the east. Arthur turned. Through the thinning fog, banners appeared on the ridge. Horses silhouetted against the pale sky. Lances dipped as one. Lancelot had arrived. The cavalry charge struck like a hammer from the flank. Saxon's shield shattered under the impact. Men were thrown aside, trampled, screaming as hooves crushed bone and breath alike. Lancelot rode to the front, his sword rising and falling in clean, practiced arcs. His face was calm, almost distant, as if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him beyond this moment. "Press them," Arthur shouted. The Britons surged forward with renewed strength. The Saxon formation collapsed inward, then outward, breaking into desperate knots of resistance. Some fled toward the river, only to be cut down or drowned under the weight of their armor. Within the hour, it was over. The Saxons withdrew to their remaining ships, dragging their wounded, casting furious glances back at the shore they had failed to claim. Arrows followed them into the water until the longship slipped back into the mist. Silence crept in slowly, broken only by groans and the cries of the injured. Arthur lowered his sword. Victory had come, but it felt thin. The river bank was a field of bodies. Briton and Saxon lay tangled together, faces slack, eyes staring at nothing. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the cost. Arthur walked among them, removing his helmet. Every few steps, someone reached for him, a hand grasping weakly, a voice whispering his name. He knelt beside a wounded soldier whose breath rattled wetly. "We held," the man said, forcing a smile. Arthur clasped his hand. "You held." The grip loosened. The man's chest stilled. Nearby, Lancelot dismounted. He pulled off his helmet, hair damp with sweat, eyes scanning the dead. "We were close," Lancelot said quietly. Arthur nodded. "Too close." They stood together in the aftermath, two men bound by war and purpose, neither speaking of how differently the day might have ended. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light fell not on triumph, but on loss. Fires were lit for fallen. Names were spoken aloud, so they would not vanish with the smoke. Arthur watched the flames rise and felt the weight settle deeper in his chest. This was the price of holding a kingdom together. Not glory, not legend, but endless sacrifice. And this war, he knew, was only the beginning. Night returned to the river bank like a slow, heavy curtain. The fires burned low now, fed by driftwood and broken spear shafts. Smoke clung to the ground, settling into cloaks and hair, into lungs already raw from shouting and fear. Men sat where they had dropped after battle, backs against shields, staring into the flames without speaking. Victory had emptied them. Arthur moved among the wounded as the healers worked. Linen was torn into strips. Wine was poured not for celebration, but to dull pain. Every scream cut to the camp like a blade, sharp and unavoidable. A man with a shattered leg gripped Arthur's wrist. "Don't let them come again," he whispered. Arthur nodded, though he knew better than to promise peace. "Rest now," he said gently. "You've done your duty." The man tried to smile. He did not succeed. Beyond the firelight, the river whispered on, carrying blood downstream toward villages that did not yet know how close death had come to them. Somewhere in the darkness, Saxon ships moved quietly, retreating, but not gone. Arthur found Lancelot standing apart from the others, staring east. His armor lay discarded at his feet, dented and smeared. He held a whetstone in one hand, his sword in the other, drawing the blade along the stone in slow, steady strokes. "You arrived when we needed you," Arthur said. Lancelot did not look up. "I arrived when I was ordered to," he replied. "If I had come sooner, fewer would be dead." Arthur said nothing. There was no argument strong enough to blunt that truth. A sudden shout broke the quiet. Scouts returned at a run, breathless, eyes wide. "My king" movement inland. Not Saxons. Riders. Arthur straightened at once. "How many?" "Hard to say. A few dozen. Lightly armed." Arthur exchanged a glance with Lancelot. "Britons? Or worse?" Lancelot said. Arthur nodded. "Prepare a patrol." Quietly, the riders moved through the forest like shadows, moonlight breaking through branches in pale shards. Leaves crunched softly beneath hooves. No torches were lit. Every man felt the tension winding tight again, muscles aching, minds still caught in the violence of the day. They found the riders near an old stone circle, half swallowed by moss and time. The men were Britons, but not Arthur's. Their leader stepped forward slowly, palms open. "We come from the west," he said. "From lands you do not hold." Arthur studied him. The man's cloak was worn, his boots cracked, but his eyes were sharp. "Why are you here?" Arthur asked. The man hesitated, then spoke. Because your war has reached us. The Saxons you drove back will not leave. They will circle. They always do. They're already burning farms along the coast. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his chest. And you want protection. We want alliance, the man corrected. We have fighters. We know the hills. But we will not kneel. Arthur considered this. Camelot was still an idea, not a command that reached across all Britain. Every alliance came with risk. You won't kneel, Arthur said slowly, but you will stand when the horns sound. The man nodded. If you do the same. Arthur extended his hand. The pact was sealed without ceremony. By dawn, word spread through the camp. More battles were coming. Not one front, but many rivers, roads, hills. The Saxons would test every weakness. Arthur gathered his commanders beneath a half-ruined Roman arch maps were scratched into the dirt with knives. Stones marked enemy movement. They won't attack like yesterday, Arthur said. They'll raid, divide us, starve us. They'll aim for Camelot, one captain said, before it can become more than a name. Arthur's jaw tightened. Then we move first. Orders were given swiftly. Messengers rode out. Units were reorganized. Wounded who could still stand were assigned to defensive positions. The dead were buried where they fell, marked with stones and whispered prayers. As the army prepared to march, Guinevere arrived. She rode without escort, dust on her cloak, eyes bright with worry and resolve. She dismounted before Arthur, ignoring the stares. I heard the battle from miles away, she said. I knew you'd survive, but knowing is not enough. Arthur embraced her briefly. Camelot must be defended, he said, even if I'm not there. Guinevere met his gaze. Camelot is more than walls. Don't forget that. Arthur watched her ride away, a knot forming in his chest that no armor could protect. By midday, the army moved inland, leaving the river behind. Smoke rose in the distance, villages already touched by war. Children watched from doorways as soldiers passed, eyes wide, faces pale. Arthur rode at the front, Excalibur at his side, feeling the weight of every step forward. He understood now what this war truly was. Not a single battle, not a single enemy, but a long, grinding test of will, one that would demand more than strength, more than steel. It would demand sacrifice beyond counting. And the road ahead was only beginning to darken. The march inland stripped away any lingering illusion of triumph. Fields that should have been green were blackened, their soil torn by hooves and fire. Smoke drifted low over the countryside, stinging the eyes and settling in the throat. The smell of burned grain followed the army for miles, a silent accusation carried on the wind. Arthur ordered the pace slowed when they reached the first ruined village. No horns, no banners, only the crackle of dying embers and the soft weeping of survivors who emerged cautiously from cellars and hedges. A woman knelt in the dirt, rocking back and forth, clutching a child who no longer breathed. An old man stared at the wreckage of his home, lips moving in a prayer that had lost its words. Arthur dismounted. Every step felt heavier than the last as he moved among them. Soldiers averted their eyes, shame and helplessness written across their faces. They were warriors trained to kill, not to witness this. They came at dawn, a villager said hoarsely. Not the ones you fought. Different banners. Smaller bands. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Raiders, just as he had feared. The Saxons were scattering like wolves, tearing at the edges while the main force regrouped. How many taken? Arthur asked. The man swallowed. Too many. Arthur stood, his decision already forming. We follow the tracks. Lancelot frowned. They'll lead us into the hills. Narrow paths. Ambush country. Arthur nodded. And if we don't, there will be no villages left to save. The pursuit began at once. The trail was clear. Burned wagons, broken fences, the occasional bloodstain where someone had fallen trying to flee. The hills rose sharply, wooded and dense, the path winding tighter with every step. Birds scattered at the army's approach, their sudden flight setting nerves on edge. Arthur raised a fist. The column halted. A sound carried to the trees, metal tapping stone, faint but deliberate, not accidental. "Ambush!" someone whispered. Arthur scanned the slopes. Too quiet, too still. Then the first javelin flew. It struck a shield with a crack, followed by another that took a man in the shoulder. Saxons burst from the undergrowth, howling, axes swinging. They struck fast, aiming not to hold ground but to break formation. Close in. Arthur shouted. The Britons reacted instinctively, shields locking as they had been trained. The narrow path worked against the attackers now, limiting their numbers. Lancelot led a countercharge up the slope, cutting through the first wave with ruthless efficiency. A Saxon lunged at him, only to be unhorsed and trampled as Lancelot's blade flashed down. The fight was sharp and brief. Within minutes, the attackers fled deeper into the hills, abandoning their dead. Arthur did not pursue. "They wanted to slow us," he said, and they succeeded. As the army pressed on, the land grew harsher. Rocky outcrops forced them into single file. The sky darkened as clouds gathered. Rain began to fall in cold, stinging sheets. Armor grew heavy. Hands numbed around sword hilts. Near dusk, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Below them, smoke curled upward. A camp. Saxon raiders clustered around fires, loot piled carelessly, livestock, sacks of grain, torn cloth. And near the center, bound figures knelt in the mud. Arthur felt something twist inside him. "How many?" he asked quietly. Lancelot studied the scene. 50, maybe 60. Tired, overconfident. Arthur nodded. "We strike now." There was no horn this time. The Britons descended in silence, rain masking their approach. The first Saxon fell without a sound, a knife across his throat. Then another. A shout broke out too late. Steel flashed in firelight. The camp erupted into chaos. Men scrambling for weapons, captives screaming. Fires kicked over. Arthur charged straight toward the center, Excalibur cutting a path through confusion and fear. A Saxon tried to use a captive as a shield. Arthur did not slow. His blade took the man down in a single motion. "Run!" Arthur shouted to prisoners. "Go!" Some stumbled. Others froze, shock locking their limbs. Britain soldiers rushed to cut bonds, dragging people away from the fighting. The raiders fought desperately now, realizing escape was slipping away. Lancelot drove them back toward the valley's edge, where the ground fell away steeply. "Yield!" Arthur called. They did not. The end was brutal and swift. When it was over, the rain had washed the blood into the dirt, leaving dark stains that would not fade easily. The rescued villagers huddled together, trembling, eyes fixed on Arthur as if he were something unreal. A young girl stepped forward, her face smudged with ash. "You came," she said simply. Arthur knelt to her level. "We will always come," he said, though the promise cut him deeply. That night, the army made camp in the valley. Fires were kept low. The rain finally eased, leaving a heavy silence behind. Arthur sat alone, staring into the darkness. Each victory brought more responsibility. Each decision sent ripples he could not control. He understood now that being king meant choosing who would suffer. And when, in the distance, thunder rolled, the storm was far from over. Morning broke cold and gray, the valley still heavy with mist. The army rose stiff and sore, armor clinking softly as men prepared to move again. No one spoke much. The night's rescue had brought relief, but not peace. Too many questions lingered. How many more raids? How many villages already lost beyond their reach? Arthur walked the edge of the camp, watching the rescued villagers gather what little strength they had. Some would return home. Others had no homes left to return to. They looked at him not as a warrior now, but as a promise that frightened him more than any Saxon blade. A rider arrived at speed, mud streaked up his legs, breath ragged. He dismounted hard, nearly stumbling. "My king," he said, "from the south. Bad news." Arthur braced himself. "Speak." "Camelot's outer settlements have been hit. Not burned, but tested. Probing attacks. They withdrew before our garrison could fully respond." A low murmur passed through the commanders nearby. Arthur felt the weight settle deeper. "They're measuring us." Yes, the messenger said. And there's more. Roman ruins near the old road. Saxons are fortifying them, turning stone into strong points. Lancelot exhaled slowly. Smart. They know we can't be everywhere. Arthur stared toward the horizon. Camelot lay beyond those hills, still unfinished, still vulnerable. If the Saxons anchored themselves along the roads, they could choke the heart of the kingdom before it ever truly lived. We split, Arthur said at last. Several heads turned sharply. We don't have the numbers, one captain warned. Not for divided fronts. Arthur nodded. And if we don't, we lose the roads, the villages, and Camelot soon after. Lancelot, take the cavalry south. Disrupt their forts. Burn what they build. Lancelot hesitated only a moment. And you? I'll take the infantry west, Arthur replied. There are tribes there watching, waiting to see if we are worth following or abandoning. The army divided before noon. Arthur's column moved through rolling hills, grass bending under the wind like waves on a dark sea. Scouts ranged ahead, signaling with hand signs, always listening. Every rustle set nerves tight. By the second day, they reached the western borderlands, territory held loosely by Briton clans who had long resisted any king. Arthur sent messengers ahead, unarmed. The response was cautious. At sunset, Arthur rode forward alone, stopping well short of the assembled warriors who waited on the ridge above. Spears bristled. Shields were painted in symbols unfamiliar to him, ancient, local. A man stepped forward, older, his beard braided with bits of bone and bronze. You wear a crown without wearing it, the man said. Why should we follow you? Arthur did not draw his sword. Because the enemy will not ask who you follow, he said. They will only ask how easily you burn. The man studied him for a long moment. We survived without kings. Arthur nodded. You have. And now the world is changing. A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Arthur continued, voice steady. Stand alone and you will fall alone. Stand with us, and you will bleed, but not without purpose. Silence followed. Then the old man planted his spear in the ground. We will fight, he said, but not for your throne, for our land. Arthur inclined his head. That is enough. The alliance was uneasy, but real. 2 days later, news reached Arthur from the south. A breathless rider delivered it, eyes shining with exhaustion and awe. Sir Lancelot broke their stone forts, drew them into open ground. It was costly, but the road to Camelot still stands. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Relief washed through him, followed quickly by dread. Costly always meant the same thing. That night, Arthur walked the perimeter of the camp, listening to the sounds of many tribes, sharing one fire. Different songs, different prayers, one purpose. He thought of Guinevere, of Camelot rising slowly from earth and stone. He thought of the young girl in the valley who had believed his promise without hesitation. The next morning, the Saxons struck again, not in force, but with fire. Villages burned in 3 directions at once, plumes of smoke clawing at the sky. Scouts rode in frantic loops, shouting warnings, pleading for orders. Arthur stood at the center of it all, feeling the pull of every road, every cry for help. There were not enough men. There never would be. He made his choices quickly, decisively. Units were dispatched. Others were held back, protecting supply lines, guarding the vulnerable. Every order saved someone and doomed someone else. By nightfall, the fire still burned on the horizon. Arthur stared into the darkness, understanding fully now what this war demanded. Not heroism, but endurance. The fires on the horizon did not fade with the night. They pulsed like open wounds, marking villages Arthur could not reach, people he could not save. The wind carried the smell of smoke across the camp, clinging to everything, settling deep into cloth and skin. Men slept in short, broken stretches. Dreams were worse than wakefulness. At dawn, Arthur summoned his commanders. Faces were drawn, eyes hollow. Maps were spread again on the ground, their edges curling from damp and ash. They're stretching us thin, one captain said. If we chase every flame, we'll collapse. Arthur traced a finger along the roads with quiet precision. Then we stopped reacting. Silence followed. We take their center, Arthur continued, not their raiding bands. Their heart, the main Saxon war host gathering beyond the eastern hills. Lancelot's absence was felt sharply now. Arthur missed the clarity of his voice, the way he saw battles as clean lines instead of bleeding wounds. How do we reach them? Another commander asked. They'll see us coming. Arthur shook his head. Not if we don't march like an army. The plan was dangerous. Fragmented movement, false trails, night marches through forest and marsh. Infantry stripped down to essentials. No banners. No horns. By dusk, Arthur's force dissolved into shadows. They moved by starlight, guided by men who knew the land as instinct, not map. Roots tore at boots. Cold water soaked cloaks as they waded through streams without bridges. Every snapped twig froze the column in place. Near midnight, they reached the edge of the marshlands. A low, wet expanse stretched before them, mist rising in slow curls. Somewhere beyond it lay the Saxon host. Hundreds of warriors gathered for final push inland. Arthur crouched, studying the ground. They won't expect us here, he said quietly. They believe this land impassable. A Briton scout smirked. Only to those who don't belong to it. The crossing was agony. Men sank knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, hauling one another free. Armor was stripped and carried. Spears were used as walking staffs. More than once, someone nearly vanished beneath the black water, pulled back by desperate hands. They did not speak. Breath and effort were the only sounds. Just before dawn, they reached firmer ground. Ahead, through thinning mist, fires glimmered. The Saxon camp sprawled across a low rise. Tents clustered around wagons, weapons stacked carelessly, sentries few and bored. They were preparing to move, confident, unaware. Arthur felt the moment settle into place. He raised his hand. The attack began without a sound. Knives first, throats open in the dark. Fires kicked over, sending sparks swirling. Then the shouting erupted, confused, panicked, too late. Arthur surged forward, Excalibur cutting through startled resistance. Saxons stumbled from tents half-armored, some barefoot, grabbing weapons as Britons crashed into them. The advantage was total, at first. Then the Saxon war drum sounded. Deep, steady, relentless. From afar into the camp, ranks formed with terrifying speed. Shields locked, axes rose. Their war leader emerged, a massive figure wrapped in mail, his voice booming above the chaos. Arthur felt the shift again. The moment surprise bled into confrontation. Hold! Arthur shouted, rallying his men around him. Press through. The battle became a furnace. Firelight flickered wildly, casting monstrous shadows. The smell of burning cloth mixed with blood and sweat. A Saxon spear grazed Arthur's side, slicing through mail and flesh. Pain flared white-hot. He ignored it, driving forward, refusing to give ground. Around him, Britons fought like men who knew retreat meant annihilation. One warrior took an axe to the chest and still struck back before falling. Another dragged a wounded comrade from beneath trampling feet, screaming in defiance. Arthur faced the Saxon war leader at last. The man grinned beneath his helm. You should have stayed behind your walls, King. Arthur answered with steel. Their clash rang out, louder than the rest. Two forces colliding, neither willing to yield. The Saxon strength was immense, each blow rattling Arthur to the bone. Arthur relied on speed, precision, memory drilled by endless combat. Excalibur found its mark. The Saxon leader staggered, then fell, his roar cut short. For a heartbeat, the Saxon line wavered. Arthur seized it. Now! The Britons surged forward, shattering cohesion. Panic spread. Orders broke down. Men fled toward the marsh, only to sink and vanish screaming into the mist. By sunrise, the camp was broken. The cost lay everywhere. Arthur stood amid the wreckage, blood seeping through his armor, breath ragged. He had won something vital, not peace, but momentum. Messengers were sent at once. Signals lit on distant hills. The Saxon advance had been cut at its core. As Arthur sank to one knee, the weight of exhaustion finally crushing down, he understood the truth with brutal clarity. This victory would buy them time. Nothing more. And time, in war, was always bought with blood. The victory in the Saxon camp had given the Britons breathing room, but the respite was fragile, fleeting. Smoke still curled from burned tents, mingling with mist over the low hills. Men moved silently, exhausted, tending to wounds, stacking weapons, and burying those who could not be saved. The smell of wet earth, blood, and ash clung to everything, a reminder that the night's triumph had come at a cost. Arthur walked among his soldiers, feeling each step as a reminder of responsibility he could not shed. Faces lifted briefly when he passed, hope flickering in eyes otherwise shadowed by grief. The weight of leadership pressed heavily. Each command, each decision, had demanded blood, and the ledger was far from balanced. "Scout reports?" he asked, stopping at the edge of the ridge overlooking the burned camp. A young officer, mud-streaked and weary, handed him a rough sketch of enemy movement. "They retreated northeast," the man said. "Small groups scattered, likely attempting to regroup along the river valleys." Arthur nodded. The pattern was familiar. Saxons probing, testing defenses, withdrawing when met with force. But he knew they would return, bolder, hungrier. Their strategy was relentless attrition. Lancelot joined him then, silent, placing a hand briefly on Arthur's shoulder. "We can't remain here," he said. "They will strike back once their strength returns. We must consolidate, secure villages, and rally allies before they mass again." Arthur's eyes followed the retreating smoke. "And the clans to the west? They will not wait forever. If we linger, we risk losing their support." "Then we move," Lancelot said simply, swiftly, before the Saxons gathered their numbers anew. The column reformed at first light. Britons, weary but disciplined, marched through damp fields, boots sinking into mud and frost. Villages along the route had been warned, some fortified hastily, others abandoned, the air heavy with anxiety and unspoken fear. Children watched from shuttered windows, wide-eyed, unsure whether to hope or hide. At midday, scouts signaled from a hilltop ahead, movement in the valley below. Arthur and Lancelot spurred forward to assess. "They're not Saxons," one scout said. "Local warriors, armed, cautious." Arthur dismounted, scanning the line of men assembled below. Spears raised, shields overlapping, eyes wary. They were Britons, but their loyalty was conditional, uncertain. The clans he had spoken to days before, hesitant allies who weighed every choice against survival. Arthur lifted his hand, signaling peace, and stepped forward alone. "I am Arthur," he called, voice carrying across the valley. "I do not come to command, but to offer alliance. The Saxons push south. They test our strength. If we stand divided, they will burn us all." A murmur passed through the assembled warriors. The oldest among them, a man with gray braid and eyes sharp as flint, stepped forward. "You speak of war, yet we see only smoke and death," he said. "Why should we trust one king over another?" Arthur met his gaze. "Because without trust, we are nothing, and without action, we die." The man considered him for a long moment, the wind tossing his cloak. Finally, he nodded. "We will ride with you," he said. "But understand this. Our loyalty is earned in battle, and we fight for our land first." Arthur inclined his head. "Then let our swords fight together." By sunset, the allied forces were organized. Britons from distant hills joined Arthur's army, banners waving cautiously, symbols unfamiliar yet proud. The new arrivals brought knowledge of the terrain, archers skilled in ambush, and warriors hardened by years of defending home soil. The army, though larger, was a patchwork of loyalties, still fragile, yet stronger than before. Night fell. Fires were lit in small clusters, deliberately low, to avoid detection. Arthur moved among the men again, checking ranks, listening to concerns, assessing morale. Even in victory, exhaustion and fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of courage. A rider arrived unexpectedly, breathless, mud streaked across his cloak. "My king," he gasped. Scouts report Saxon activity near the northern hills. They moved swiftly, gathering raiding parties. They are aware of your presence. Arthur's jaw tightened. How many? Too many to meet head-on, the scout admitted. They are spread thin but coordinated. If they strike tomorrow, they could surround a village before reinforcements arrive. Arthur exhaled slowly. The calculus of war never paused. Every action created reaction. Every movement carried risk. Lancelot placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we strike first, he said. We disrupt their coordination before they can consolidate. Arthur nodded. At dawn, we move into the northern hills. Stealth, precision, surprise. He knew the march would be grueling. Steep inclines, cold stone underfoot, fog-laden valleys where one misstep could cost lives. But the stakes demanded it. Camelot's rise depended not on hesitation, but on bold, decisive action. Through the night, preparations were made. Weapons were cleaned, armor checked, and positions rehearsed. Men whispered prayers, rubbed mud from wounds, and whispered names of the dead to keep memory alive. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Every heartbeat was a countdown to the coming clash. Arthur walked alone for a moment, observing the mist curling around distant fires. He thought of the villages already burned, of lives lost in pursuit of survival. He thought of Guinevere, of Lancelot, of the clans who had chosen to stand with him, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle like a stone in his chest. The morning would demand courage, not the brash heroics of a single warrior, but the endurance of many. Strategy, timing, and sacrifice would be their weapons as much as swords and shields. Every step forward carried risk. Every command held consequence. The first light of dawn broke over the hills, a pale wash against gray mist. Arthur mounted his horse, Excalibur at his side, and signaled the army to follow. The northern hills awaited, silent but dangerous, holding the promise of both victory and loss. Every man knew the coming day would test them beyond anything they had endured before. Arthur's eyes swept across the formation, taking in each warrior, each ally. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. They were far from home, far from safety, but they rode with purpose. The future of Camelot, of Britain itself, depended on what they would do next. And as the first shafts of sunlight cut through the mist, the army began its ascent into the hills, moving like shadows, preparing to strike before the enemy could gather strength. War awaited them, not the first, not the last, but one more crucible to prove their resolve. The northern hills were cold and silent as the army pressed forward. Mist clung to ground, curling around boots and hooves, hiding the path and shrouding the slopes in gray. Each step was measured, deliberate. The Britons knew the terrain better than the Saxons, yet even familiarity could not erase the tension that gripped every soldier. Every snapped twig, every distant call of a bird seemed to herald disaster. Arthur rode at the front, Excalibur resting lightly across his lap. The sword felt heavier now, not from its weight but from the burden it represented. The lives it could take, and the lives it had already claimed. Behind him, Lancelot moved with the precision of a man accustomed to both command and chaos, scanning the ridges for any sign of enemy scouts. They had spotted movement ahead. Faint shapes among the rocks, glimpses of steel catching the dim light. Saxon raiding parties, perhaps 10 or 12 men, spread thinly, likely attempting to scout Arthur's approach or lure them into a trap. The Britons halted, crouching low behind boulders and scrub, watching and waiting. Arthur signaled with a quiet hand gesture. "We take them silently," he whispered. "No fire, no horn. We strike as shadows." The soldiers nodded, hearts pounding. Every man understood the delicate balance. One mistake could alert the Saxons, turning this reconnaissance into slaughter. The first Briton stepped forward, moving like a wraith among the rocks. A Saxon scout lifted his head, unaware of the movement behind him. A knife flashed, silent but deadly. Another fell. The line pressed forward with lethal precision, taking down the Saxons one by one, each death muffled by the thick fog and wet ground. By the time the main Saxon group realized the attack, it was already too late. Panic erupted in their ranks, shouts and cries cutting through the mist. The Britons pressed the advantage, striking with swords, spears, and axes, overwhelming the small party before they could retreat or regroup. Arthur moved into fray himself, Excalibur slashing cleanly through armor and bone. The sound of metal meeting flesh was deafening in his ears, yet in the mist it was all the world could hear. One Saxon lunged at him, screaming in fury. Arthur parried, twisted, and drove his blade through the man's side. The scream died as suddenly as it began. When the last of the scouts were cut down or fled into the hills, Arthur stood amid the carnage, chest heaving, rain dripping from his cloak. His soldiers, faces streaked with mud and blood, looked to him, waiting for the next command. "Press forward," he said. "The main force is near. We have momentum. Do not squander it." The army moved cautiously through the narrow valleys, the hills pressing close on either side. Visibility was poor, mist clung to every surface. Scouts ran ahead, returning with reports of larger Saxon contingents gathering near a river bend. They were camped openly now, assuming the Britons had been delayed or turned back. Arthur studied the reports. They are confident, too confident. That will be their mistake. The Britons set up a position along the higher ground overlooking the river. The terrain favored the defenders. The Saxons, unaware of the ridge's vantage, were exposed in the lowlands below. Arthur considered the options. He could wait and let the Saxons move, risking further raids on villages, or he could strike now, using surprise and terrain to his advantage. He chose to strike. Orders were given swiftly. Archers took positions along the ridge, arrows tipped with iron and poisoned where possible. Spears were prepared to drop onto the enemy from above. Infantry moved silently, ready to descend. Every man understood the plan. Failure was not an option. As the Britons waited, the river's surface mirrored the gray sky, water rushing swiftly over rocks. Across the river, Saxons began their morning routines, tending to fires, sharpening weapons, arguing among themselves. They were careless, lulled into a false sense of security by the apparent lack of resistance. Arthur's hand rested on Excalibur's hilt. He felt the pulse of his soldiers through the ground beneath his boots. He sensed the tension, the readiness, the anticipation. This moment would define them, not just in battle, but in history. At a silent signal, arrows rained down from the ridge. Screams erupted from the Saxon camp as men fell. Fires ignited by flaming projectiles. Chaos spread quickly. Arthur gave the order to descend, and the Britons surged down the hillside with a roar that carried through the mist. The Saxons scrambled to defend themselves, forming loose lines, swinging axes and swords in desperation. But the Britons had the high ground and the element of surprise. Each step forward brought more chaos, more panic, more death. Excalibur flashed again and again as Arthur led the charge, cutting a path straight to the heart of the enemy formation. Lancelot struck from the flank, a deadly shadow moving through the disorder, turning Saxon confidence into confusion. The allied Briton clans fought beside him, arrows flying, spears thrusting, shields clashing. The valley echoed with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of men determined to survive. Despite the ferocity of the fight, Arthur kept his focus, eyes scanning for the Saxon leader. Every commander he spotted tried to rally their men, but momentum was on Arthur's side. With each fallen leader, the Saxons faltered further. By mid-morning, the river bend was littered with bodies. Fires burned low, smoke rising in thin ribbons. Those Saxons who had not been killed fled into the hills, disorganized and demoralized. The Britons regrouped, breathing heavily, faces streaked with mud, blood, and sweat. Arthur surveyed the scene. The victory was decisive, but he felt no triumph. Each life lost weight on him. Every scream he had heard replayed in his mind. War was never clean, never fair. It was the endurance of cruelty and courage in equal measure. Lancelot approached, wiping blood from his blade. "They underestimated us," he said, "and paid dearly." Arthur nodded, staring across the river where the Saxons had fled. "This will slow them," he said, "but it will not end them. They will return, stronger, angrier, and we must be ready." He walked among the soldiers, offering brief words of encouragement, checking on the wounded, acknowledging acts of courage. Each man had played a role in the victory, yet none of it brought comfort. Every step forward was shadowed by the knowledge of what would come next. As the sun broke through the mist in weak shafts of light, Arthur realized the war was far from over. Each village saved, each Saxon defeated, was merely another moment in a longer struggle. Camelot's rise would depend not just on swords, but on endurance, strategy, and the loyalty of those who chose to fight alongside him. The Britons set camp on the ridge overlooking the valley, tending to their wounded and preparing for what they knew would come, the inevitable Saxon retaliation. The river below flowed relentlessly, carrying remnants of the battle downstream, indifferent to human suffering. Arthur stood at the edge of the camp, eyes on the distant hills. Every victory demanded vigilance. Every life taken weighed on him, and every decision could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. In the quiet that followed the storm of battle, he whispered a promise to himself and the land he sought to protect. That Camelot would endure, that Britain would stand, and that the sacrifices of this day would not be forgotten. The northern hills were silent again, but Arthur knew this was only a momentary peace. The war was far from over. The valley lay quiet under a pale morning sun, the mist retreating slowly to reveal the scars of the last battle. Charred tents, broken carts, and scattered weapons marked the Saxon retreat, a grim testament to the Britons' determination. The soldiers moved carefully among the remnants, gathering what could be salvaged, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the inevitable retaliation. Victory had been won, but the cost was written on every mud-streaked face. Arthur rode along the ridge, Excalibur sheathed at his side. He studied the landscape, noting the paths the Saxons might use to regroup, the defensible positions they might seize, the villages at risk from raiding bands. Every decision carried weight. Every choice could mean life or death. Reports from scouts, a captain said, approaching Arthur, indicate Saxon forces gathering in 3 directions. They're moving toward the eastern plains and the river valleys. Small bands, but coordinated. It seems they intend to stretch us thin, divide our focus. Arthur nodded slowly. They've learned something. They know we cannot be everywhere at once. And that is their advantage. But we will deny them success if we move wisely. Lancelot appeared beside him, eyes scanning the horizon. We cannot defend every village simultaneously, he said. But we can force them into terrain of our choosing. Narrow passes, rivers, and forests favor us more than open plains. Arthur's gaze shifted to the distant hills, where smoke still rose faintly from burned homesteads. Then we choose the ground, not the enemy, he said. We force them to fight where we hold the advantage, and we strike decisively. The army broke camp at first light, moving toward the passes the scouts had identified. The columns were silent, disciplined, every man alert to the faintest sound. The terrain grew rugged, rocky paths twisting upward, narrow enough that the Saxons could not bring their numbers to bear. The Britons, though weary, pressed forward with grim determination. Scouts returned mid-morning with troubling news. The Saxons have fortified the ridge ahead, one reported. They built barricades from stones and felled trees. Archers are in position. Arthur dismounted, studying the site. The fortifications were crude but effective, taking full advantage of the natural slope. Any frontal assault would be costly, perhaps catastrophic. He weighed his options carefully. Retreat was not possible. Villages to the south were still at risk, and the Saxons' morale would be strengthened if they held this ridge. We will not charge blindly, Arthur said. We will force them out. The plan formed quickly. Lancelot would lead a detachment on the left, moving through a hidden gully to flank the Saxons. Archers would take positions along the adjacent ridges to cover the movement, raining arrows upon any who revealed themselves. Arthur would lead the main force up the center, appearing as a direct threat, drawing attention and engaging the enemy in controlled skirmishes. By midday, positions were in place. The Britons waited, tension thick in the air, each man knowing the cost of misstep. The Saxons, confident in their fortifications, remained largely unaware of the flanking maneuver forming beyond their sight. Arthur raised his sword, signaling the archers. A volley of arrows arced silently through the air, landing among the Saxons' forward guards. Screams erupted as men fell, some wounded, some dead, creating confusion in the ranks. Arthur's main force surged forward, shields locked, spears ready, the sound of clashing steel ringing against stone and wood. The Saxons responded quickly, countering with axes and thrusting spears, trying to hold a ridge. But the flanking force struck from the gully, arrows and swords cutting down those who tried to regroup. Panic spread. The Saxons were forced back, step by step, their cohesion unraveling under coordinated pressure. Arthur pressed forward, moving through the chaos with practiced precision. Each swing of Excalibur struck decisively, each step measured to avoid overextension. Around him, his soldiers fought with a mix of fear, desperation, and determination. They had seen death before, but the stakes had never been higher. Hours passed in the brutal rhythm of combat. The ridge changed hands multiple times, the Saxons resisting with stubborn fury. But the Britons' discipline, knowledge of terrain, and strategic flanking proved decisive. By late afternoon, the Saxons' defenses collapsed entirely. Those who survived fled down the opposite side of the ridge, leaving the Britons in possession of the stronghold. The cost was heavy. Many of Arthur's men lay wounded or dead among the rocks. The ground was slick with mud and blood, the air thick with smoke, the metallic scent of death lingering. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering brief words of encouragement, checking on the wounded, and ensuring order was maintained. Lancelot approached, wiping blood from his blade. "They will regroup again," he said. "We have forced them back, but they are not finished." Arthur nodded, his expression grim. "We have slowed them, and we have bought time for the villages and for Camelot. That is all we can do today." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ridge, the army consolidated. Fires were lit, not as beacons, but carefully contained, to avoid drawing attention from scouts or remaining Saxon forces. Men tended to wounds, shared water, and prepared for another night of vigilance. Arthur walked along the ridge, looking down at the valley below. The Saxons' retreating smoke marked the distance between victory and disaster. Every triumph came with cost. Every moment of respite was temporary. Yet he knew that each action, each battle, contributed to something larger, a vision of a united kingdom, a Camelot that could endure beyond blood and fire. He paused near a small cluster of soldiers who had been particularly steadfast during the battle. "Your courage has not gone unnoticed," he said. "Each of you carries the hope of this land forward. Remember that." The soldiers nodded, exhaustion and pride mingling on their faces. In that quiet moment, amid the ruins of battle and the lingering mist, there was a sense of unity, fragile but real. Arthur turned his gaze toward the horizon. The northern hills were behind them, the southern valleys still at risk, the Saxons regrouping, plotting, waiting. The war was far from over, and every day would demand strategy, endurance, and sacrifice. Yet in the midst of exhaustion, despair, and blood, Arthur felt something else, a sense of resolve. Camelot would rise, Britain would endure, and those who fought alongside him would know that their struggle, their courage, and their sacrifice were not in vain. The night fell slowly over the ridge, stars appearing faintly through the dissipating mist. The army settled into watch rotations, torches flickering in the wind. Arthur remained awake, standing at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur sheathed but close at hand, eyes on the distant horizon. The Saxons would return, as he knew they must. But so would the Britons, ready, disciplined, and united. And in that determination, Arthur found the strength to continue, to lead, and to fight for the vision of a kingdom that could survive even the darkest of times. The northern hills were silent once more, but Arthur understood that silence was only temporary. The storm of war was far from over, and the days ahead would test courage, loyalty, and endurance in ways not yet imagined. And he would meet it all head-on. The morning arrived with chill that cut through cloaks and armor alike. Mist still clung to the valleys, rolling slowly along the slopes as though reluctant to leave the land. Arthur surveyed the camp from a high ridge, his gaze tracing the paths the Saxons might take, the rivers they could use as natural barriers, and the villages still exposed to raiders. Every movement, every choice, weighed heavily upon him. Lancelot joined him quietly, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the distant tree line. "They will not wait long," he said. "The Saxons are relentless. They will probe again, seeking weakness, testing for divisions in our ranks." Arthur nodded. "Then we must strike first, while they are still disorganized. They underestimate us because they do not understand what it means to fight for this land, for our people." Orders were given to prepare the army. Britons moved with practiced efficiency, though exhaustion was visible on every face. Wounded men were carried to safety, weapons inspected, armor adjusted, and scouts sent to report on enemy movements. The army would march toward the eastern plains, where reports indicated the Saxons had regrouped and were consolidating their raiding parties. By mid-morning, the Britons descended from a ridge, moving silently through the thick mist. The paths were narrow and treacherous, forcing the column into a single-file formation in places. Each man knew the stakes. One misstep could lead to ambush, one error could mean disaster. Scouts returned with word of the Saxon forces ahead. Several hundred men, entrenched along the banks of a shallow river that cut through the valley. They had constructed makeshift barricades of wood and stone, and archers were positioned along the slope. The Saxons appeared confident, unaware that the Britons were approaching through hidden gullies and narrow forest paths. Arthur studied the site carefully. A frontal assault would be costly, possibly catastrophic, but flanking maneuvers could turn the tide, provided they were executed with precision. "We will divide our forces," Arthur said. "Lancelot, take the cavalry through the eastern woods. Strike at their flank and rear. The archers will take the ridge to cover the approach. I will lead the infantry along the central path to engage and hold their attention. We move as one, silent until the moment of attack." The plan was dangerous, but necessary. The Britons waited until the sun had climbed high enough to cast shadows across the valley, masking their movements. Then, without warning, arrows began to fall from the ridge, striking the Saxons' forward guards. Panic spread through the enemy ranks as the Britons descended into the valley with sudden ferocity. Arthur led the charge down the central path, Excalibur flashing in the dim light. The Saxons swung axes and thrust spears, attempting to hold the line, but the Britons' discipline and knowledge of terrain gave them the advantage. Lancelot's cavalry struck the eastern flank with devastating force, cutting down archers and cutting off escape routes. The valley erupted into chaos, screams and clash of steel echoing against the hillsides. Despite the intensity of the battle, Arthur maintained focus, moving with precision through the chaos. Every step, every strike, was calculated to maximize effect while minimizing risk to his own men. Around him, soldiers fought with desperation and courage, aware that survival depended on cohesion and coordination. Hours passed in relentless combat. The Saxons' lines wavered, then broke. Those who survived fled across the river, many drowning in the swift current, their armor and weapons weighing them down. Fires smoldered where barricades had been destroyed, smoke curling into the sky like silent witnesses to carnage. Arthur's body ached from exertion, his armor battered and streaked with blood. He moved among his soldiers, offering words of encouragement, checking on the wounded, and ensuring order was maintained. Each act of care, however small, was a reminder that victory demanded more than sword and shield. It required leadership, endurance, and compassion. As the sun began its descent, the valley fell into a tense silence. The Saxons had been defeated, but the cost was high. Many Britons lay injured or dead, the ground slick with blood and mud. Arthur surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction, knowing that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the larger war was far from over. Lancelot rode up, his armor dented but his expression resolute. "They will return," he said. "This will not be the end. But we have shown them the price of underestimating us." Arthur nodded, eyes on the distant horizon where smoke from other villages still lingered. "We have bought time," he said quietly. "Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day brings new battles. Each decision carries weight." As night fell, the army set camp along the ridge overlooking the river. Fires were lit low, careful to avoid detection, and watch rotations were established. Soldiers tended to wounds, cleaned weapons, and shared water and meager rations. In the quiet moments, whispers of the fallen passed through the ranks, prayers and memories mingling with the crackle of flames. Arthur remained on the ridge, Excalibur at his side, staring at the distant hills. Every victory had come at a price, and every respite was temporary. The Saxons would regroup, reinforce, and embolden, testing their strength against the Britons again and again. Yet in that quiet night, Arthur felt a renewed sense of purpose. Camelot was rising, not as a place of stone alone, but as a symbol of unity, resilience, and hope. Every battle, every choice, every sacrifice contributed to that vision. He turned to Lancelot, who stood beside him, eyes fixed on the darkened valley below. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we will endure. We will fight, and we will rise." Lancelot nodded. "For Camelot, for Britain, for those who cannot fight for themselves." Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the weight of command settle into resolve rather than despair. The northern hills were quiet once more, but the war was far from over. Tomorrow would demand more strategy, more courage, more sacrifice, and he would meet it all, as he always had, with unwavering determination and the knowledge that every step forward brought Britain closer to the hope he envisioned. The army rested, but Arthur remained vigilant, knowing that true peace would not come until the Saxons were defeated, and Camelot could rise unchallenged. The night held its silence, the mist curling around the fires, and in that stillness, Arthur allowed himself a brief moment of reflection before the next day demanded action. Dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern plains, the air heavy with mist that rolled off the distant hills. The Britons stirred quietly, boots sinking into the damp earth, armor rattling softly as men prepared for another day of relentless pursuit. The victory in the northern valley had bought time, but Arthur knew that the Saxons were already regrouping, plotting, testing for weaknesses they could exploit. Arthur mounted his horse at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur sheathed at his side. He surveyed the valley below, noting villages that remained vulnerable, small streams that could conceal enemy movements, and hills that could serve as defensive positions. Every detail mattered. Every choice carried consequences. Reports from scouts, Lancelot said, riding up beside him, voice low. Small Saxon detachments are moving along the southern road. They are raiding isolated settlements, avoiding our main forces. It seems they are attempting to spread us thin again. Arthur nodded. Then we must anticipate their strategy. Divide to fight them separately, strike swiftly, and force them to react on our terms. Orders were given immediately. Infantry was dispatched to secure threatened villages. Archers took positions along high ridges, and cavalry prepared for rapid strikes. The army moved with practiced efficiency, despite fatigue and lingering wounds from previous battles. Every man understood that hesitation could cost lives, and that precision now would shape the days ahead. By mid-morning, scouts returned with a report that the Saxons had established a temporary stronghold near a river bend, using felled trees and stones to create crude barricades. Archers were positioned along slopes, their vantage points giving them dominance over surrounding fields. Arthur studied the terrain carefully, weighing options. A direct assault would be costly. Flanking maneuvers would require stealth and timing. "We cannot take them head-on," Arthur said, pointing toward the river bend. "We will use the forest to the east to flank their position. Lancelot, lead the cavalry along that path. I will draw their attention from the main approach." The plan required precision. Britons moved silently through dense undergrowth, boots muffled by fallen leaves, eyes alert for movement or sound. Every step was measured. The slightest misstep could alert the Saxons. The flanking force crept closer, Excalibur's presence unseen but felt, a symbol of leadership and courage among the soldiers. At the first sign of morning light, Arthur gave the signal. A volley of arrows rained down from the ridge, striking the Saxons' forward guards and creating confusion. Screams and shouts erupted from the enemy camp as the Britons descended into the valley, moving with lethal coordination. Arthur led the charge down the central path, Excalibur flashing in precise strikes. The Saxons swung axes and spears, attempting to maintain their line, but the Britons' discipline and knowledge of terrain gave them an edge. Lancelot's cavalry struck the eastern flank with devastating effect, cutting through archers and disrupting the enemy's rear. Chaos rippled to the Saxon ranks, their formations collapsing under pressure. The battle stretched across the valley for hours. The sound of clashing steel, cries of the wounded, and the roar of men determined to survive filled the air. Arthur moved steadily, every strike deliberate, every step measured. Around him, his soldiers fought with desperation and courage, their training and determination allowing them to hold the advantage. The Saxons attempted to regroup near the river, but the Britons' flanking maneuver had cut off escape routes. Men who tried to retreat found themselves surrounded or forced into the swift current, where many were swept away. Fires ignited in the enemy camp as barricades fell, smoke rising in thin spirals that marked the battlefield with the evidence of victory and loss. Hours later, the valley fell silent, save for the crackle of dying fires and the distant murmur of running water. The Saxons had been defeated, though the cost of the Britons was high. Many lay wounded or dead, the ground slick with blood and mud. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering words of encouragement, checking on the injured, and ensuring order was maintained. Leadership was as much about tending to the living as striking down the enemy. Lancelot rode up, armor dented and bloodied. "They will regroup again," he said, his voice steady despite exhaustion. "But today we have shown them the price of underestimating us." Arthur nodded. "We have bought time," he said quietly. "Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day will demand more. The Saxons are patient, and they will return stronger and more cunning." As the sun began its descent, the Britons consolidated their position along the ridge overlooking the valley. Fires were lit cautiously, low to avoid drawing attention, and watch rotations were established. Soldiers tended to wounds, shared water, and whispered prayers for those who had fallen. In the quiet moments between the chaos, they found strength and unity, in the shared purpose that bound them together despite fear and fatigue. Arthur stood at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur at his side, gazing at the distant hills. Every victory carried weight, and every decision bore consequences. The Saxons would not relent. They would continue to test, to probe, to challenge. But the Britons had shown resilience, strategy, and courage. Camelot's rise depended not on one victory, but on the endurance and loyalty of those who fought alongside Arthur. Night fell over the plains, the mist curling around the fires, a blanket over a battlefield temporarily at peace. Arthur remained vigilant, knowing that true security would not come until the Saxons were defeated and Camelot could stand unchallenged. He turned to Lancelot, who stood beside him, eyes scanning the distant valley. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we endure, we fight, and we will rise." "For Camelot," Lancelot replied, "for Britain, for those who cannot defend themselves." Arthur exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of command to settle into resolve rather than despair. The night held its quiet, a brief reprieve, yet the war was far from over. The coming days would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice beyond what had already been given. And Arthur would meet it all, as he always had, with determination tempered by the knowledge that every action, every battle, brought Britain closer to the vision he had fought to preserve. The eastern plains were still once more, but Arthur knew that the calm was temporary. The storm of war was far from ended, and the trials ahead would test every soldier, every decision, and every ounce of endurance. Camelot's promise rested on this, and he would not falter. The dawn was gray and heavy, the kind of morning that pressed down on the soul and chilled the bones. The Britons stirred in the camp along the eastern ridge, armor clinking softly, breath steaming in the cold air. The men were weary from the last battle, but Arthur knew the Saxons would not rest, and neither could he. Every village still standing, every road still open, depended on action, on vigilance, and on courage. Arthur mounted his horse, Excalibur sheathed at his side. Lancelot rode up beside him, surveying the distant valley where smoke still lingered faintly from the previous day's fighting. "They're gathering again," Lancelot said, voice low. "Scouts report small bands converging on the northern pass. They may be testing our lines or looking for an opportunity to strike isolated villages." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Then we will not wait for them to find us. We will meet them on our terms." He scanned the valley, noting every ridge, every stream, every hidden path. "We must divide our forces carefully. I will lead the infantry along the central pass to engage them directly. Lancelot, take the cavalry and strike their flank from the woods to the east. Archers will cover both movements from the high ground. Timing and coordination will be everything." The army moved with quiet determination, boots sinking into the damp earth, weapons ready, every man alert to the faintest sound. The morning mist thickened, hiding their movements and lending an unnatural silence to the world around them. Scouts returned with reports of Saxon positions, small groups entrenched along the riverbanks. Their formation spread to cover as much territory as possible. They had built crude barricades of wood and stone, with archers stationed along the slopes. Arthur studied the terrain carefully, weighing the risks. A frontal assault could be deadly, but a well-coordinated flanking maneuver could break their lines quickly. "We attack in 3 waves," he said. Archers first to disrupt and confuse. Infantry engages and hold their attention. Cavalry strikes their flank and rear. The Britons waited, tension thick in the air, every man understanding that success required precision, patience, and courage. At a silent signal, arrows rained down on the Saxons, striking their forward guards and causing immediate chaos. Screams of pain and orders shouted in panic echoed through the valley. Arthur led the infantry forward, shields locked, spears ready, moving like a tide against the enemy's defenses. The Saxons fought with stubborn determination, axes swinging, spears thrusting, attempting to maintain their line. But the Britons' discipline and knowledge of terrain allowed them to press the advantage. Lancelot's cavalry struck from the east, cutting through archers and disrupting the enemy's rear. Panic spread to the Saxon ranks, cohesion collapsing under pressure. Hours passed in brutal combat. The valley echoed with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of men determined to survive. Arthur moved through the chaos, every strike precise, every movement calculated. Around him, soldiers fought with desperation and courage, their training and experience giving them the edge. The Saxons attempted to regroup near the river, but the Britons' coordinated attack had cut off escape routes. Men who tried to retreat were forced into the swift current. Many swept away by the icy water, their armor and weapons dragging them under. Fires erupted among the fallen barricades, smoke rising in thin plumes that marked the battlefield with the evidence of death and destruction. By late afternoon, the battle had shifted decisively in favor of the Britons. The Saxons' lines were broken, their morale shattered. Those who survived fled, leaving the field to Arthur's army. The victory was significant, but the cost was high. Many Britons lay wounded or dead, the ground slick with blood and mud. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering words of encouragement, checking on the injured, and ensuring order was maintained. Leadership demanded more than swordplay. It required care, strategy, and endurance. Lancelot approached, his armor dented, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "They will recover," he said. "They will return stronger, angrier. But today we have made our mark. They will think twice before attacking openly again." Arthur nodded, his gaze on the distant horizon, where smoke from other villages lingered. "We have bought time," he said quietly. "Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day brings new challenges. The Saxons are relentless. Their cunning is as dangerous as their swords." The army consolidated along the ridge as night fell. Fires lit low to avoid attracting attention. Watch rotations established. Soldiers tended to wounds, shared meager rations, and whispered prayers for those lost in battle. The quiet moments allowed them to breathe, to remember, and to steel themselves for what would come next. Arthur stood at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur at his side, looking across the valley. Every victory carried the weight of consequence. Every life lost, every village saved, every strategic choice would shape the war to come. The Saxons would not relent. They would probe, test, and attack again. But the Britons had demonstrated resilience, strategy, and courage. Camelot's rise depended not on a single victory, but on endurance, loyalty, and unbroken will. Night deepened, and the mist curled around the fires like ghostly fingers. Arthur remained vigilant, knowing that the calm was temporary. The war was far from over, and the days ahead would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice beyond what had already been given. He turned to Lancelot, who stood silently beside him, eyes scanning the darkened valley. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we endure. We fight, and we will rise." "For Camelot," Lancelot replied. "For Britain. For those who cannot fight for themselves." Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the weight of command settle into resolve rather than despair. The night held its quiet, a fragile peace before the storm. The Saxons would return, as he knew they must, but the Britons would be ready. Camelot's promise rested on the courage, strategy, and unity of those who fought alongside him. The eastern plains were still once more, but Arthur understood the calm was temporary. The storm of war was far from over, and the trials ahead would test every soldier, every leader, and every ounce of endurance. Yet he would meet it all, as he always had, with determination, skill, and unwavering commitment to the vision of a united Britain. The morning broke with a brittle chill, the kind that seeped through armor and cloak alike, reminding every soldier that war was as much a trial of endurance as of skill. The Britons moved through the low valleys cautiously, every step measured, eyes scanning for signs of Saxon raiding parties or hidden ambushes. Each man carried the weight of yesterday's victories and losses alike. The field of battle left marks not only on the body, but on the mind. Arthur rode at the front, Excalibur sheathed, his hand resting lightly on its hilt. He felt the pulse of his army in the rhythm of boots and hooves on damp soil, in the quiet murmurs among the men, in the cautious glances toward the distant hills. Lancelot rode beside him, surveying the horizon with a soldier's eyes and a strategist's mind. Scouts report movement near the western ridge. Lancelot said, "Small groups, likely Saxon war bands. They are probing, testing for weakness, seeking to lure us from the main road." Arthur's gaze followed the ridge, noting every dip and rise in the terrain, every cluster of trees that might conceal enemy movement. "Then we meet them on our terms," he said. "We will not chase shadows. We will shape the battlefield to our advantage." Orders were given swiftly. Infantry formed the central column, moving along the main valley path to engage any frontal threats. Archers took positions on small rises and along the edges of the forest to cover approaches and disrupt enemy formations. Cavalry, under Lancelot's command, prepared to flank and strike from hidden gullies, ready to cut off escape routes or deliver decisive blows. The army advanced silently, mist curling around their boots, muffling sound, masking movement. Scouts returned intermittently with reports, small Saxon detachments appearing and disappearing like phantoms among rocks and trees, retreating when pressed, reappearing elsewhere. Each encounter tested patience, discipline, and strategy. The Britons could not afford rash action. Every step needed to be deliberate, every choice calculated. By mid-morning, the Saxons had formed a temporary encampment near a narrow stream that cut through the valley, using fallen trees and stones as barricades. Archers were positioned on slight rises, ready to rain arrows on any approaching enemy. Arthur studied the terrain carefully. A direct assault could be deadly, but a coordinated flanking maneuver could turn the enemy's overconfidence against them. "We will divide our forces," Arthur instructed. "Archers will soften them from above. Infantry engages centrally, drawing their focus. Cavalry will strike their flank from a forested ridge. Timing will be critical. Strike together, and we overwhelm them before they realize the trap." The army moved into position, tension taut in the air like a drawn bowstring. The Britons waited, boots pressed into mud, breath visible in the chill, every eye scanning the fog-draped terrain. When the first shafts of sunlight broke through the mist, Arthur gave the signal. Arrows arced silently through the air, striking Saxon sentries and causing immediate chaos. Shouts and screams echoed as the infantry surged forward, shields locked, spears ready, pressing against the Saxon barricades. The enemy swung axes and thrust spears, attempting to hold their line, but the Britons' discipline and understanding of the terrain allowed them to advance steadily. Lancelot's cavalry struck on the flank, cutting down archers and disrupting the enemy's rear. Confusion spread like wildfire, cohesion crumbling under pressure from multiple directions. The battle raged for hours. The valley rang with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the roars of men determined to survive. Arthur moved among his soldiers with precision, striking where needed, directing movement, and keeping his men coordinated. Around him, courage and desperation mingled, each man knowing that survival depended on skill, focus, and unity. The Saxons attempted to retreat toward the stream, but the flanking cavalry cut off escape routes. Many fell into the icy water, weighed down by armor and weapons, swept away by the current, their screams carried by the wind. Fires ignited among the barricades. smoke spiraling skyward as the battlefield bore witness to the chaos and destruction. By late afternoon, the Saxons' lines were broken, their morale shattered. Those who survived fled across the valley, leaving the field to Britons. Victory had been achieved, but at significant cost. Many Britons were wounded, and the ground was slick with mud and blood. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering words of encouragement, tending to the injured, and ensuring order was maintained. Leadership demanded care as much as command. Lancelot rode Arthur's side, his armor battered, his face streaked with grime and blood. "They will regroup," he said, voice steady but tired, stronger, angrier. "But today we have shown them the cost of underestimating us." Arthur's eyes swept the valley, noting the distant smoke from other villages and the pathways the enemy might use to regroup. "We have bought time," he said quietly. "Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day brings new challenges. The Saxons are relentless, patient, and cunning. As night fell, the army consolidated along the ridge. Fires lit low to avoid attracting attention. Watch rotations were established, and soldiers tended wounds, shared rations, and whispered prayers for fallen. In the quiet moments between vigilance, they found solace in unity, in the knowledge that they had fought together, survived together, and would face whatever came next as one. Arthur remained at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur at his side, looking out over the valley. Every victory carried weight. Every decision bore consequence. The Saxons would return, as he knew they must, testing patience and strength. Yet the Britons had demonstrated courage, strategy, and discipline. Camelot's rise depended not on a single triumph, but on endurance, loyalty, and the steadfastness of those who followed Arthur into battle. Night deepened, the mist curling around the fires like spectral fingers. Arthur stood vigilant, understanding that the calm was temporary. War was far from over, and the days ahead would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice beyond what had already been given. He turned to Lancelot, who stood silently beside him, eyes sweeping the darkened valley. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we endure, we fight, and we will rise." "For Camelot," Lancelot replied, "for Britain, for those who cannot fight for themselves." Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the weight of command settle into resolve rather than despair. The night held quiet, a fragile pause before the storm. The Saxons would return, testing the Britons' strength and resolve. But Camelot's promise rested on the courage, skill, and unity of those who fought alongside him. The valley was still once more, but Arthur knew the calm was temporary. The war was far from over, and every coming day would test strategy, endurance, and courage in ways yet unseen. Yet he would meet it all, as he always had, with determination, precision, and unwavering commitment to the vision of a united Britain. The chill of dawn settled over the western plains, a thin frost glinting across the grass and the edges of the river that cut through the valley. Arthur's army moved with quiet precision, boots sinking into damp soil, the occasional clink of armor echoing softly in the mist. Yesterday's victories weighed heavily upon every soldier, their bodies sore, their spirits tense, yet the knowledge that the Saxons would return sharpened their resolve. Arthur rode at the front, Excalibur sheathed, his eyes scanning every ridge, every cluster of trees, every potential path the enemy might use. Lancelot rode beside him, scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. "Reports from scouts," Lancelot said quietly, "indicate Saxon forces are consolidating along the northern forest. They have regrouped, smaller in number, but better coordinated. They are preparing to raid again, likely hoping to catch us spread thin." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Then we do not wait. We will dictate the terms of engagement. We will shape the battlefield to our advantage and force them into a fight on our conditions." Orders were issued swiftly. Infantry would advance along the central valley, drawing the enemy's attention. Archers were positioned along the high ridges to provide covering fire and disrupt enemy formations. Cavalry, under Lancelot, would move through hidden paths along the forested slopes to flank the Saxons and strike at their rear. Coordination, timing, and discipline were paramount. The army advanced cautiously through the mist, boots muted against the soft earth, eyes alert for ambushes. Scouts returned intermittently with reports. Small Saxon detachments appearing and vanishing among rocks and trees, retreating when pressed, reappearing elsewhere. Every encounter tested the Britons' patience, discipline, and tactical judgment. They could not afford rash action. Every move had to be deliberate. By mid-morning, the Saxons had formed a temporary camp near the western stream, using fallen trees and stones to build crude barricades. Archers were stationed on slight rises, giving them control over surrounding terrain. Arthur studied the formation carefully, weighing options. A direct assault would be costly, but a well-coordinated flanking maneuver could break the enemy before they realized their vulnerability. "We strike in 3 waves," Arthur instructed. Archers first to sow confusion. Infantry engages centrally to hold their attention. Cavalry moves from the forested slopes to strike their flank and rear. Timing is everything. Strike together and overwhelm them before they can regroup. The Britons waited, tension taut in the air, boots pressed into frost-laden earth, breath visible in the chill, eyes scanning the fog-draped terrain. When the first shafts of sunlight pierced the mist, Arthur gave the signal. Arrows rained down from the ridges, striking the Saxons' forward guards and immediately disrupting their formation. The infantry surged forward, shields locked, spears thrusting, moving as one tied against the Saxons' barricades. The enemy swung axes and thrust spears, attempting to maintain their lines, but the Britons' disciplined terrain knowledge and coordinated assault allowed them to press steadily forward. Lancelot's cavalry struck from the forested slopes, cutting down archers and disrupting the enemy's rear. Confusion spread like wildfire. The Saxons' cohesion crumbled under pressure from multiple directions. The battle raged for hours. The valley rang with the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of men determined to survive. Arthur moved among his soldiers with precision, every strike measured, every motion deliberate. Around him, courage and desperation mingled, each man fighting with all he had, knowing survival depended on skill, focus, and unity. The Saxons attempted to retreat toward the stream, but the flanking cavalry had cut off escape routes. Men who tried to flee were swept into the cold current, weighed down by armor and weapons, many drowning as cries echoed in the valley. Fires erupted among the fallen barricades, smoke spiraling skyward, marking the battlefield with the evidence of chaos, destruction, and the cost of conflict. By late afternoon, the Saxons' lines were broken and their morale shattered. Those who survived fled, leaving the field to the Britons. Victory had been achieved, but the price was high. Many Britons were wounded or dead, the ground slick with blood and mud. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering words of encouragement, tending the injured, and ensuring order was maintained. Leadership demanded care and command, strategy and compassion. Lancelot rode Arthur's side, armor dented in face, streaked with grime. "They will regroup again," he said. "They will strike back stronger and angrier. But today, we have reminded them of the cost of underestimating us." Arthur's eyes swept across the valley, noting distant smoke from other villages and the paths the enemy might take to regroup. "We have bought time," he said quietly. "Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day brings new challenges. The Saxons are patient, cunning, and relentless." Night fell, and the army consolidated along the ridge, overlooking the valley. Fires were kept low to avoid attracting attention. Watch rotations were established, and soldiers tended wounds, shared rations, and whispered prayers for fallen. The quiet moments allowed reflection and a fragile sense of unity. The men drew strength from each other, from the knowledge that they had fought together, survived together, and would face what came next as one. Arthur stood at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur at his side, gazing across the valley. Every victory carried weight. Every choice bore consequence. The Saxons would not relent. They would probe, test, and attack again. But the Britons had demonstrated courage, discipline, and strategic acumen. Camelot's rise depended not on single victories, but on endurance, loyalty, and the unbroken will of those who fought alongside Arthur. The night deepened, mist curling around the flickering fires. Arthur remained vigilant, understanding that the calm was temporary. War was far from over, and the days ahead would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice beyond what had already been given. He turned to Lancelot, who stood silently beside him, eyes sweeping the darkened valley. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we endure. We fight, and we will rise. For Camelot, Lancelot replied. For Britain, for those who cannot fight for themselves. Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the weight of command settle into resolve rather than despair. The knight held his fragile peace, a brief reprieve before the storm. The Saxons would return, testing the Britons' strength and resolve. Yet Camelot's promise rested on courage, unity, and unshakable determination. The western plains were still once more, but Arthur understood that this calm was fleeting. The storm of war had not ended, and every coming day would test strategy, endurance, and courage in ways yet unseen. Yet he would meet it all, as he always had, with determination, precision, and unwavering commitment to the vision of a united Britain. The final morning broke cold and gray, the frost glittering like scattered jewels across the plains. Arthur rode at the head of his army, Excalibur sheathed but ever present at his side. The Britons were weary. Their bodies ached from weeks of continuous engagement, yet their spirits remained steadfast. Each man had faced death and witnessed the cost of war, yet they had endured, driven by loyalty to Arthur, to Camelot, and to the land they sought to protect. Scouts returned with urgent news. Saxon forces are massing on the eastern ridge, one reported. They are larger than we anticipated, perhaps twice the number of our last engagement. They are well-armed and organized, likely seeking a decisive confrontation. Arthur's jaw tightened. Then we will not falter. Today we end this threat, or at least ensure they will think twice before challenging us again. Prepare the men. Every village, every road, every valley must be defended. We will shape the battlefield to our advantage one final time. Orders were relayed swiftly. Infantry took positions along the central valley, shields locked, spears braced. Archers climbed the ridges on either side, ready to disrupt enemy formations. Cavalry, under Lancelot's command, prepared to maneuver along hidden gullies and flanking paths, striking where the Saxons least expected. The army moved with quiet discipline, the tension palpable, the weight of anticipation heavy in every heart. As the morning mist rose from the valley floor, Arthur gave the signal. Arrows soared through the fog, striking the forward guards of the Saxon force. Shouts of alarm echoed across the ridge as the Britons advanced. The infantry surged down the valley, a disciplined wave of shield and steel, moving in perfect unison. The Saxons attempted to hold their lines, axes and spears swinging, shouting orders in desperation. But the Britons' coordination, knowledge of terrain, and disciplined assault began to break their formations. Lancelot's cavalry struck the flank and rear with deadly precision, cutting through archers and creating chaos among the enemy ranks. Confusion spread like wildfire, and the Saxons' morale began to falter. Hours passed in relentless combat. The valley resounded with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless roar of men fighting for survival. Arthur moved through the chaos, every strike of Excalibur precise, every command measured. Around him, courage and desperation mingled in the faces of his soldiers, each man aware that survival depended on skill, focus, and unity. The Saxons attempted to retreat toward the river at the valley's edge, but the flanking cavalry cut off escape routes. Many were swept into the icy water, their armor dragging them under as cries echoed through the valley. Fires ignited among barricades, smoke spiraling skyward, marking the battlefield the evidence of victory, death, and devastation. By late afternoon, the Saxon lines were decisively broken. Those who survived fled, leaving the field to the Britons. The victory was hard-won, and the toll was high. Many Britons were wounded or dead, the ground slick with mud and blood. Arthur moved among the survivors, offering encouragement, tending the injured, and ensuring order was maintained. Leadership demanded not only strategy but care, endurance, and empathy. Lancelot approached, armor dented in face, streaked with grime and blood. They will regroup elsewhere, he said. But today, they have learned the price of challenging us directly. Arthur nodded, eyes sweeping the valley, noting distant smoke from villages and the routes the enemy might take to regroup. We have ensured a reprieve, he said quietly. Time to fortify, to train, to prepare. But each day brings new challenges. The Saxons are patient, cunning, and unrelenting. As night fell, the army consolidated along the ridge overlooking the valley. Fires were kept low to avoid drawing attention, Watch rotations were established, and soldiers tended to wounds, shared meager rations, and whispered prayers for fallen. In these quiet moments, the men drew strength from one another, from the knowledge that they had fought together, endured together, and survived together. Arthur stood at the edge of the ridge, Excalibur at his side, gazing across the valley. Each victory carried weight. Every decision bore consequence. The Saxons would not relent entirely, but their ability to challenge Camelot directly had been curtailed. The Britons had demonstrated courage, discipline, and strategic skill. Camelot's rise depended not on a single victory, but on endurance, loyalty, and the unbroken will of those who fought alongside Arthur. The night deepened, mist curling around the flickering fires, and Arthur remained vigilant, understanding that true peace was still far off. War had taught him that calm was fragile, fleeting, and temporary. The coming days would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice beyond what had already been given. He turned to Lancelot, who stood silently beside him, eyes scanning the darkened valley. "The road ahead is long," Arthur said, "but we endure. We fight, and we will rise." "For Camelot," Lancelot replied. "For Britain. For those who cannot defend themselves." Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the weight of command settle into resolve rather than despair. The night held its quiet, a fragile peace before the storm. The Saxons would return in some form, testing strength and resolve. But Camelot's promise rested on courage, unity, and unwavering determination. The valley lay still, the stars faintly glimmering through the dissipating mist. Arthur allowed himself a moment of reflection, thinking of the villages saved, the sacrifices made, and the men and women who had fought bravely by his side. Every step forward, every battle fought, had carved the path toward a vision of a united Britain. He raised Excalibur slightly, letting the sunlight glint off the blade. It was not only a weapon, but a symbol, the promise of protection, justice, and enduring leadership. The war had exacted a heavy toll, but it also forged a unity, a discipline, and a courage that would carry Camelot into the future. Arthur turned back to his soldiers, weary but steadfast, their faces marked by mud, blood, and determination. "We fight not only for ourselves," he said, voice carrying across the ridge. "We fight for those who cannot, for the villages, for the families, for the hope that Britain may endure. Remember this, for it is not the sword alone, but the courage and loyalty of every one of you that will shape our future." Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of fires and distant night birds. The men nodded, understanding that every word was truth, that every sacrifice mattered. Arthur knew that this was the essence of leadership, not glory, but responsibility, endurance, and vision. The night held its calm, the battlefield quiet, yet the lessons of the day lingered in every mind and every wound. Arthur looked once more across the valley, then back toward the ridge where Camelot would rise, not just in stone, but in the hearts of those who fought, endured, and believed. The war was not fully over, but a decisive step had been taken. The Saxons had been repelled, their plans thwarted, and Camelot's promise had been defended. Arthur's thoughts turned toward the future, toward a vision of a united kingdom, where courage, sacrifice, and loyalty could create something enduring and just. In that quiet moment, with Excalibur at his side and the mist curling around the fires, Arthur allowed himself a rare feeling of hope. The battles had been hard, the losses heavy, but the Britons had endured, and Camelot would endure. And as the night stretched on, the stars above witnessing the struggles and sacrifices below, Arthur knew that this was only the beginning. The cost of war had been high, but the courage displayed, the unity forged, and the vision upheld would carry Britain forward for generations to come. Camelot would rise, and the story of this war, the courage, the sacrifice, and the enduring spirit, would be remembered long after the fires had died, a testament to what it meant to fight not for glory, but for a people, a land, and a future worth protecting.